Matt Schaff and Jared Smola of DraftSharks.com here for one of the last few waiver wire shows of the season. It's week 16, Jared. We're going to get to a few candidates in a minute, but first I got to ask you, what do you think about this staggered 2-game Monday night thing that they started doing this year?
I like it. The more island games, the better for me. Just the more football I can watch without having to, go back on Monday morning and watch the rewind, the better.
It's the kind of thing that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I don't know why they're competing against themselves in a spot like that, but if they're going to give us 2 crappy games, I guess it's better that we get the chance that one of those ends up not being crappy, even if neither one ends up not being crappy. So I can't ultimately complain about it too much, but it does strike me as weird. But we're not here to focus on that. We're here to focus on the waiver wire for teams that are still in it. It is time to focus in completely on what's going to help your team and what's not going to help your team, much more than specific players. It's time to spend whatever it takes to get the piece or pieces you need. It's time to consider dropping anything that's not going to help you over the next 2 weeks. Like, don't worry about who it is that you're dropping, as long as it's also not somebody that's going to help one of your opponents either this week or a potential opponent next week. So just keep all of those specific things in mind. At this point, they are all much more important than, the exact individual, what he might be able to do, what you're hoping for, situation, all that. That said, we're going to talk about these specific candidates for this week, names pulled from our waiver wire pickups article. And again, like last week, it focuses primarily on running back because there are plenty of teams out there that are even successful overall that have issues at running back. Jared, who is your top running back target this week, assuming that your team is in need of one?
Jerome Ford for me, who will be taking over as the Browns lead back with Nick Chubb out for the season. And by the way, that was probably the most impactful injury week of the season so far. I think, I guess good thing it came in week 15, but I'm sure there are teams that, need waiver help this week, even that are still alive because of those injuries we had last week. So it's Jerome Ford for me. We saw him in this lead role over the first 5 games of the season before Ford got hurt and before Nick Chubb came back. In those 5 games, Jerome Ford averaged 9.6 carries per game, but 4.6 targets per game. Those 57% of the team's carries, a 14% target share. He played 67% of the Browns offensive snaps over those 5 games. He was actually RB 30 in both expected PPR points per game and actual PPR points per game. So not going to be a week winner, probably, not going to be a league winner the rest of the way. We could get a few more carries, this week and next week than the 9.6 he averaged. I think the targets, he's going to struggle, to get to 4.6 because it's going to be Dorian Thompson-Robinson under center. For one, he's not a good quarterback. And 2, he's a scrambling quarterback. So we're probably going to get more scrambles than check down to running back. So maybe something like 12 carries and like 3 targets for Ford, something like that. We know he's an explosive player. He showed that again this past week with the long touchdown. And then he gets this good matchup against the Bengals, who are 27th in run defense DVOA, 22nd in adjusted fantasy points allowed through running back. So you're going to find Ford pretty safely inside RB3 territory in our week 16 rankings.
It's so stupid that we're getting Dorian Thompson-Robinson. I mean, I get it after Jameis Winston has the game he did against the Chiefs, but we know what he is. I mean, they knew what he was when they signed him. He's the kind of player who can put up 40 points on the Broncos and then completely implode a couple weeks later. That's just what you're signing up for. So I guess if you think Dorian Thompson-Robinson can become a starting quarterback, then fine. I don't, but it makes it a fantasy wasteland this week. And really looking at everything makes, I think, Jerome Ford and Alexander Mattison very similar fantasy candidates this week. Neither has been very good fantasy wise this year. You mentioned good numbers for Jerome Ford early. I think Deshaun Watson was probably good for Jerome Ford's receiving value at that point. He was bad for everybody else's because he couldn't complete any passes downfield. He had to check down to the running backs. That was good for Jerome Ford. We'll see exactly what volume looks like. They certainly should increase the rushing volume this week, but we'll see if the Bengals score too many points for them to actually stick with the running game in that one. So neither Ford nor Mattison's been very good overall. Neither offense is exciting at this point. Both players are thrust into larger week 16 roles than their teams would prefer. The Browns are currently implied for 20.5 points against the Bengals, Raiders for 19 against the Jaguars. So again, neither is an offense that anybody's excited about. Both have upside matchups in terms of the defenses they're facing. The Browns have the second fewest running back carries on the season, ahead of only the Raiders. The Raiders have 20 more running back receptions for the year, Browns are tied for 24th in that category. Again, as soon as Watson went down, it got worse with Jameis Winston. It's probably not going to get any better with DTR in the lineup. Ford has not topped 10 carries in a game since week 1, despite that stretch to begin the season where we had no Nick Chubb. He's had just 2 games with more than 13 touches. That was way back in weeks 1 and 4. And Jared, I thought this was a funny number for how close Mattison and Ford are overall. Alexander Mattison's averaging 53.5 total yards per game. Jerome Ford is averaging 53.1 for the season. Now, obviously different situations led to that. Alexander Mattison started behind Zamir White, overtook him for a little bit, then gave way to Sincere McCormick more recently. Jerome Ford's just kind of been in a committee in Cleveland. Neither exciting. Both can be options this week. Both should get touches. I mean, if I need one of them, I think it's Ford because he does have the big play upside, but I'm probably putting in the same bid for both players basically and just taking whichever one lands on my team. Again, assuming that I need somebody who's a good bet for touches in week 16.
Yeah, I think it's close for sure. I actually would bet on Mattison getting more touches this week. Remember, we had the 4-game stretch in the middle of the season when Mattison was like the Raiders' clear lead back. He had 16.5 carries per game over those 4 games, plus 4 targets per game. I remember talking about it. I think it was on this podcast that he was 7th among running backs in expected PPR points over those 4 games. Now, he was only 30th in actual PPR points because he's not a great player. The running game has been horrible all season. So that's the thing here. I think Mattison's a slightly better touch bet. I think Ford's just a better player, a good bet to be more efficient. So it's close. I'd feel a bit more excited putting Ford into my lineup if I had to this week than having to throw Mattison in there.
If you're feeling excited about putting Jerome Ford in this week, I don't love your chances at making the finals in your league. I do, however, see more upside in Kendre Miller and Tyjae Spears as options this week. I think there were less good bets for touches this week if you need a week 16 starting option, but if you're in a slightly different situation, or if we learn more about the starters for either of these teams, these guys could be more impactful over the next 2 weeks. Kendre Miller first sits nearly a yard ahead of Alvin Kamara in yards after contact per attempt this season, according to PFF's numbers. He has also doubled Kamara in missed tackles forced per carry, 0.39 to 0.19 for Kamara. So he's run well, again, on very limited opportunities so far. So it's a small sample, but Kendre Miller's done well in that small sample that he's gotten. Gets a Raiders matchup in week 17 if we get to that point. And of course, the factor that we're kind of waiting to see on is Alvin Kamara's groin injury. Knocked him out last week. We don't really know his status yet for week 16 and then certainly next week.
Yeah, we'll see about Kamara, which makes it tough having to decide on Kendre Miller versus these other guys. That's a nice thing about Jerome Ford is that we know Nick Chubb is out. Even Sincere McCormick, we don't know if he's out yet for the Raiders. We're assuming he is because it's short week. It looks like a pretty nasty ankle injury. And listen, the numbers you said about Miller are awesome. I still think he's a really good back. I know he hasn't popped in the box score yet, but if you just watch these Saints games, most of his runs are impressive. I think he's a good player. The downside for Kendre Miller this week is the Saints are 13.5 point underdogs in Green Bay with a 14.25 point implied total. That might be the lowest implied total we've seen all season. And there are some bad offenses in the NFL. There's been some low implied totals, but 14.25 is at least one of the lowest we've seen all year. So it's tough to get excited about Kendre Miller in this situation. Now, after Kamara left that game last week, Miller got all 9 of the running back opportunities, 8 carries and 1 target to nothing for Jamal Williams. I would expect Williams to mix in. They'll probably have Jordan Mims active for that game as well if Kamara's out. But I think Darren Rizzi actually likes Kendre Miller. So I think Kendre Miller will get most of the work if Kamara's out.
And they're probably going to switch to Spencer Rattler at quarterback, which obviously is going to completely blow things up for our sake. Tyjae Spears, Jared, probably not available in most cases, especially in leagues of at least modest depth, but should be snapped up anywhere that he is available, I think. Not that I believe Tony Pollard's going to miss time going forward, or even that Spears is necessarily playable the next 2 weeks, but he showed us last week with a pair of touchdowns despite sharing the field with Pollard what is possible. Tennessee does have the 4th best running back schedule over the next 2 weeks at Indy, at Jacksonville. So that's a couple of games that they could very well stay in for both of those weeks. We look at this as a team that has a good chance of falling behind, which can tend to hurt running back production, but I think they can stay in with both of those teams. If they do fall behind, Spears has worked ahead of Pollard as a receiver the past 2 weeks. And Pollard is at best dealing with an ankle issue. So if he were to go down this week, Spears is going to look like a potential league winner next week.
Yeah, I was going to say with Spears, I don't know if you want the Titans, playing close or playing lead. You might want them trailing. It's tricky to read what happened last week in the backfield. It finished 17 carries for Pollard to just 4 for Spears, but Spears had all 7 of the running back targets, had a big day in the receiving game. Now, I do think part of that was game script related. They, fell behind, once Levis started throwing his pick sixes, they fell behind and, the Titans kind of had to go pass heavier with Mason Rudolph under center. You also had Pollard re-injuring the ankle early in the game. He obviously came back, but, that might have played a part in Spears playing more. Spears did get 2 goal line carries in the first quarter of that game. He scored on the second one. So he did mix in early, so that might have been part of the plan all along. And Pollard has been dealing with multiple lower body injuries throughout the season. The Titans season obviously going nowhere at this point, so it would make sense for them to back off Pollard. I think ultimately I would not want to trust Spears in fantasy lineups this week, just not knowing. It could go back to being 70% Pollard this week. It wouldn't shock me, but I don't know if Pollard's ankle ends up being worse than they thought even coming out of that game, and he ends up missing this week, or if something happens again in week 16, I do think Spears would be an RB2 play if Pollard were out.
You can read more about the RB candidates in our pickups article. And of course, pay attention to the Shark Bite section on draftsharks.com for updates on all the injury situations that could impact these guys throughout the week. Jared, running backs aside now, is there a wide receiver worth picking up for help in week 16?
I think Jalen McMillan is definitely interesting. I think we mentioned him on this show last week. I know he was definitely in the waiver article last week. Followed up his 2 touchdown game the previous week with another strong outing. This past week, he has 24 and 22% target shares now over the last 2 games. He's been a full-time player now for the last 3 games. He looks like an ascending rookie. We see this with rookies as they kind of get better over the second half of the season, especially late in the season. Baker Mayfield continues to roll. He's playing excellent. And then you get the Bucs at Dallas this weekend, so no weather concerns in that game, I guess, besides the sunlight coming through the windows. And you have the Bucs with a 27-point implied total as well. It's one of the highest of the week, so it's a good spot for McMillan. I think most teams probably won't need him. I think he's at best like a wide receiver 4 play, but if you did have injuries hit last week, I think McMillan he showed us the upside these past 2 weeks.
I got a feel for Browns fans watching their team go from bad quarterback to bad quarterback while Baker Mayfield's out tearing it up for somebody else. Jalen McMillan might be able to sneak into wide receiver 3 territory. I think he definitely is potentially helpful to teams this week, and I don't really see a whole lot beyond that to go chasing unless it's an especially deep league. Jaden Reed, Deebo Samuel are going to be candidates for our top 36 this week. They combined for 50 receiving yards last week. And so it's not like they are, trending upward after rough patches. So that's the state of low wide receiver 3 into wide receiver 4 territory. If you've got guys that are working for you, don't go hunting for secrets this week. Just play what's working.
You mentioned Deebo Samuel. I mean, if I've been starting him and McMillan's available in my league, I think I would pick up McMillan and start him over Deebo Samuel this week.
Yeah, I would have a hard time not doing so as well. Favorite tight end target? I think we have to start by talking about Brenton Strange. But if I'm looking for a tight end in my PPR league, I think it's tough not to chase the targets that he got last week. Obviously, I'm not going to expect 12 targets ever again for Brenton Strange, but if he could do that last week, then that at least tells me that's a possibility this week. And that's a whole lot better than most other options on waivers. If it's not full PPR, I think we have to be a lot more realistic with the outlook for Strange, and he just kind of jumps in a pool with a whole bunch of other guys.
Yeah, the Jags ran 84 plays last week, and Mac Jones threw it 46 times. So they basically played like a game and a half's worth of play volume and passing production. So you could cut that off of Strange's. Now that'd still be a nice game at that point. You're still talking about like 7 catches for Strange or whatever. But I do think he's the top pickup. I think he has the decently high floor. I mean, he was basically in the Evan Ingram role last week. He ran around on 84% of the pass plays. That's a nice number. The target share was strong, and he gets a good matchup this week. The Raiders are 29th in adjusted points allowed to tight end. So it's not a case where I'm going to pick up Brenton Strange and starting him over, some guy who's been a top 12 tight end for me all season. But if you've been streaming at the position, if you, lost your tight end one, I do think Strange is probably a decent bet to give you, 3, 4, 5 catches again this weekend.
And if we're not looking at full PPR, I think these guys are also in play. Juwan Johnson, Noah Gray, Chig Okonkwo. I don't want to overstate what he did last week, similar to Brenton Strange, because it's just an outlier in terms of usage. But we have seen Mason Rudolph be positive for Tennessee tight end targets this year. For the season overall, Tennessee tight ends have seen a target on 22.6% of the team's pass attempts. Mason Rudolph himself has targeted a tight end on 28% of his pass attempts. He had the game in Buffalo where he threw a lot of completions to tight ends. He came in that game this past week where Chigakonkwo had the big numbers. And he does get 2 games that are positive for tight end production. Colts this week, and then Jaguars in week 17 ranked 22nd and 31st in tight end coverage DVOA. So I like the upside on Okonkwo the next couple weeks if you're digging around on the waiver wire and need somebody.
Yeah, those matchups I think are the best mark in Okonkwo's favor. I still don't trust anything in the Titans passing game, and even Okonkwo's routes were not kind of where we want them to be last week. I think I prefer Stone Smart as a spot starter this week if you can't get your hands on Brenton Strange. That's assuming Will Disley's out again, but the Chargers play on Thursday night, so I think we're assuming Disley's going to be out. Stone Smart looks good out there to me. He looked good in that Chiefs game in the second half 2 weeks ago. He looked good against the Bucs this past week, and we saw Will Disley have a bunch of games in a row of solid production. The matchup's tough for Smart against Denver, but it's a spot where we've seen tight ends get target boosts because Denver's also so good against wide receivers. It looks like they're going to have Pat Surtain available for that game. So it could be a game where Herbert's forced to lean on Stone Smart a bit more than he would otherwise.
Yeah, my one hesitation with the Chargers is that they have not passed very well lately. We're working on 4 straight games of less than 220 yards passing, but we're talking about territory where no tight end is an actual good bet. So I can't argue against Stone Smart's inclusion. Streaming defense for week 16, Jared, who's your top?
So I want to mention first that they didn't make our article, but check and see if the Packers are available in your league, because they're available in 52% of sleeper leagues, and they get that Saints offense we talked about with the super low implied total, huge underdogs. Saints are on the road. It's going to be Spencer Rattler probably under center, so big upside for the Packers defense, which has been a good fantasy defense for most of the season. The Falcons, though, I think are right there as a strong spot starter this week. Home for the Giants. Who knows who's going to be under center for the Giants? It does not matter. They're all bad options, I guess, for differing reasons. Giants have a 15.75 point implied total, so only a little better than the Saints.
Yeah, you should never be like, oh crap, I was going to play the Falcons against the Giants, but not if Tim Boyle's in the lineup. The Falcons, by the way, have more than doubled their season sack total in the 3 games since they returned from bye. Had 10 heading into the bye, have 13 over the past 3 games. And, it's a good point about the Packers defense. I hope it's clear that when we're talking about streaming defenses, we're not saying this is the best defense play this week. It's like, if you need to go fishing on the waiver wire for one that's likely available, this is a good pickup. It's not start the Falcons over, the good defense that you already have. But yeah, I like the Falcons in this one. I like them better this week than the Colts, but I would also like to stash the Colts for this week ahead of next week's matchup with the Giants for all the reasons that we just talked about with the Giants. And the Colts D has been decent lately. That includes last week, where if you look at the score, it doesn't look like they played very well against Denver. They allowed 31 points, but they held the Broncos to 193 total yards. They had 3 takeaways. They're actually 7th in the league in takeaways for the season, 3+ sacks in 3 of the past 4 games. So a solid defense getting that Giants matchup. I would love to have the Colts around for week 17 if you can.
Yep, sure. We'll be talking about the Colts as the top pickup on this show next week. And even this week, there's a chance the Titans go back to Will Levis, and that puts the Colts right up there behind the Falcons as the top play this week. And even if it's Mason Rudolph, it hurts the upside, but it's still a safe defensive play. Other options for week 17, the Dolphins are going to be the Browns matchup. And I'm not sure if DTR or Jameis Winston's a better matchup. I think DTR is just as good. Maybe the interception upside isn't as big, but I think there's plenty of sack upside. The Browns aren't going to score many points with DTR under center, so I think the Dolphins are a nice option to look ahead for week 17.
I would expect that DTR is a better matchup because Jameis Winston at least comes with the potential of throwing for 300, 350 yards and some touchdowns to go with the picks. I don't know that Dorian Thompson-Robinson has potential anywhere near that.
No, he doesn't.
Check out the week 16 waiver wire pickups article for more info, more potential pickups. Check your free agent finder, of course, for every one of your sync teams on draftsharks.com to get specific advice for your situation. That's the only place to compare the options actually available in each one of your synced leagues to get projected impact based on your specific scoring system and to compare the pickup options with what is currently on your roster. The free agent finder is a key reason that draftsharks.com is your unfair advantage.